Beyond Blame.
Challenging Criminalization.
For HIV Justice Worldwide.
Coming up in this webinar.
Nothing about us, without us.
Women challenging HIV criminalization in Africa.
The impact on women and people who use drugs in ICA.
Building networks in Mexico and across Francophone Africa.
Key populations, who gets prosecuted, where, and why.
Bringing science to justice, and justice to science.
And a closing message from Edwin Cameron.
You can post your questions to the panelists either in the Zoom Q&A text box, or in the Facebook comments under the live stream.
This webinar and HIV Justice Worldwide are funded by the Robert Carr Fund.
Please welcome your host, Edwin J Bernard.
Hi, and welcome to Beyond Blame, Challenging Criminalization for HIV Justice Worldwide at HIV 2020 online. Now, this applause comes from an app, but it's the sound we should all have been creating together if we'd met in person in Mexico City as originally planned. Instead, thanks to COVID-19, we're all meeting online. Now, Beyond Blame has been our flagship global meeting prior to international AIDS conferences since we first met in Melbourne in 2014. At each Beyond Blame since then, in Durban, South Africa in 2016, and in Amsterdam in 2018, the meeting has grown in scope, size, and influence. So my name is Edwin Bernard. I'm the Executive Director of the HIV Justice Network, a global information and advocacy hub for organizations and activists like you working to end HIV criminalization. So what do we mean by HIV criminalization? We're talking about criminal laws or policing that singles out people living with HIV, making us criminals for acts that wouldn't be crimes if we weren't living with the virus. In our most recent Advancing HIV Justice report, we counted 72 countries where thousands of people with HIV have unjustly been criminalized over the years. It's sometimes assumed that it's only HIV-specific criminal laws that are the problem, but more than half of these countries use other types of laws to unjustly prosecute people living with HIV. Our recently updated website provides all the latest news, data, and tools you'll need to really understand how the issue impacts all of us and impedes the HIV response. Within our new global HIV criminalization database, you can search for reported cases to see who gets prosecuted for what and where. Here, you can see where women have been arrested or accused. And digging down deeper still, you can see where women have been prosecuted simply for breastfeeding. You can also see which type of laws are being used by particular countries. Here's where there are HIV-specific criminal laws. And by clicking on the map, you can find out much more information about a particular country, for example, Russia, the country with the second highest number of cases in the world after the United States. So these data help us understand the problems of HIV criminalization. But HIV Justice Worldwide is all about building power together to find solutions. The HIV Justice Network is a proud founding member of and secretariat for HIV Justice Worldwide. And it's run by a steering committee comprising global and regional PLHIV networks and human rights organizations. You'll meet many of them during the next hour as guests on my virtual sofa. If you have questions for me or any of my guests, you can either ask them in the Zoom Q&A, or if you're watching live on Facebook, you can comment under the live stream. In the second part of the program, my co-hosts Nana Khanna and Paul Kidd will ask the guests to answer as many of your questions as they possibly can. So now, I'd like to welcome my first guest. He was a member of ACT UP in the 80s, founded Pause magazine in the 90s, and now runs the US-based Sero project, which nurtures and empowers PLHIV leadership to end mass incarceration, racism, social injustice, and of course, HIV criminalization. Welcome, Sean. Welcome.
Good morning, Edwin.
Good morning to you. Good afternoon, good evening to everyone else. So, Sean, there was a time after POS magazine when you left activism for a while to focus on other things. Why did you come back to activism, and why was the focus HIV criminalization?
I think when my health came back, I needed to take a break for a couple of years, and it gave me some distance and perspective on the epidemic. And one of the things I saw that was startling was the decreasing voice of people living with HIV and a commensurate rise in stigma. And there's no more extreme manifestation of stigma than when government makes laws or treats one part of society differently than another. And we saw that illustrated with HIV criminalization. So when I became re-engaged about 10 or 12 years ago, I really chose to focus on HIV criminalization advocacy and raising awareness of it and helping to find solutions to address it.
And so we're all familiar with that slogan, nothing about us without us. And Sero is all about empowering PLHIV leadership and networks, but you've actually taken it one step further by making sure that the voices and stories of survivors of HIV criminalization are heard. Why is that important, and what impact has this had?
Well, I don't think it's as much a step further, but I think it's the foundational step. It's the first step, is you hear and listen to the people most directly affected. And one of the things I found when I was trying to mobilize a domestic response around HIV criminalization is that I would find policy leaders who were sympathetic, but they had bigger fish to fry. It didn't seem like it was that important, or it only affected a few people, or we'd frequently, when someone would get arrested and a journalist would go to some aid service provider in an area to get a comment, they would say, well, there are a few bad apples in every bunch. People did not understand fundamentally the injustice involved or how horrific criminalization was for public health. So I really started with trying to mobilize leadership, was not very successful there. So I kind of turned around and started talking with some of the people I had met who had been criminalized, who had been treated unbelievably, hysterically, unjustly in the media. Most of them, the last thing they wanted to do was to talk to a camera or to a journalist. And over time, sort of built relationships amongst a group of people who had been criminalized and willing to speak out and to sort of put public faces on this. And those personal stories are what really began to mobilize people and get them to pay attention to what this meant.
Absolutely, Sean. And it's really the work that you've done at Sero, bringing those voices to the world has just been remarkable. So we've actually got an excerpt from Beyond Blame 2016 in Durban, where we're going to hear from 3 HIV criminalization survivors. Let's watch.
Lieutenant Colonel Ken Pinkeller was court-martialed by the US Army for alleged HIV exposure, despite no evidence that he and his accuser were ever alone together.
Pinkeller. So I had 2 things against me. I was openly gay and I was openly HIV positive. Everybody knew it. But they took me to trial without anything. And the results of that trial was I spent 272 days in Leavenworth military prison, which was not fun. And since then, I've been fighting. And with the help of Edwin and Sean, I will continue that fight. It doesn't matter if there has been transmission. It doesn't matter if there was even no sexual act, or in legal terms, no means likely whatsoever to expose a person to any disease, regardless of even HIV. I cry every morning. It just, it just comes out. Then I'm standing here after a wonderful career on an international stage with such amazing people, and I've lost everything. I am now I am now actually a burden on the very society I chose to defend. And it's wrong. It's wrong, especially when you haven't done something. There was nothing there. I've had people approach me and say, well, you must have done something. There is still that feel, even advocates, because the story is so unbelievable and so remarkable. You must have done something. And we fight that, even internally, every day.
I'm Gary Thomas. I was convicted under Idaho Code 39608 for 2 counts of attempt to transfer the HIV virus. Even though I had protected sex, I am always used a condom, and I've consistently had a undetectable viral load. My sentence is 2 15-year sentences to run consecutively with a minimum of 20 years.
Carrie, yeah, he's here. He's actually here. Carrie, just for the benefit of everybody sitting here, which is amazing, I wish you could see it, could you let us know where you're calling from?
Yeah, I'm at the Idaho, prison in Idaho.
So we're going to hand the phone over to Nana.
It's a great honor and an opportunity to get a chance to speak with you guys. It's amazing that people all over the world who are not only fighting to end the HIV epidemic, but are also working to end the criminalization that remains polluted at its core by the fear of HIV and the stain for people who are infected as well. You know, this stigma related to HIV produces discrimination in areas such as housing, employment, access to medical care and treatment, even what I call the pursuit of happiness. And it's the same stigma that continues to drive the toxic criminalization that harms far too many people living with HIV. As we know, I'm currently incarcerated in Boise, Idaho. I'm in the 7th year of a 30-year sentence for not being able to prove that I disclosed my HIV status to my then girlfriend. And one thing I want to make clear that today I believe that no one needs to face HIV alone. I believe truly HIV is beyond blame.
Harry, you just got a standing ovation here at Beyond Blame in Durban, South Africa.
Rosemary Namaburu, a nurse from Uganda, spent 10 months in prison after she was prosecuted following unfounded allegations that she exposed a young patient to HIV following a needle stick injury.
The police arrest was so brutal. I was paraded in front of the media and the people and the police. The newsmen were called. They took photos of me. They made headlines and they made man out of me. Very ugly, calling me murder, killer. This has totally changed my life, and self-esteem is gone, and the pride of more than 30 years in the nursing profession. In the nursing I loved so much. I want to be a face of the struggle against stigma and criminalization. I saw it all, I faced it all. I don't want anybody else to go through the same. I've lost everything I had, and I want to go back to where I was. And I need everybody's support to regain my life and stand, not only to be able to put food on my table, but also to fight for the other people out there who are going through such acts of injustice.
That's just, I still feel so emotional watching that, Sean, and I'm sure I'm seeing on the chat so many people feel that too. Sean, you've worked really closely with Ken and Kerry at the Sero project. How are they doing?
They're both doing well. Ken has been working with the Sero project in various capacities, including on a military a policy project called Positive Service, where we've had some success. Ken has also decided to go to law school, which I know just is so, there's just something an ironic justice in that, and a lot of us can't wait until Ken becomes a member of the bar and can put those skills to work protecting people with HIV. Kerry is now about 9 or 10 years into his 30-year sentence. He had 2 consecutive 15-year sentences. And just recently, Kerry's also on Sero's board of directors, have filed a petition with the Idaho State Commutation and Parole Board, asking them to consider changing his 2 consecutive sentences to make them concurrent. And if they make them concurrent, he could be potentially eligible for parole. So we're waiting to hear. We think we will hear on that sometime this month. So send lots of good energies and prayers, or whatever you have to offer, that Kerry can be let free sometime soon.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. Of course, so much love to Kerry, and to Ken. I know you're actually here with us, watching with us on the webinar. Love to you both.
Edwin, if I can make one quick comment about Kerry. Kerry, while he has been incarcerated all these years, he's become an incredible advocate, not just outside of the prison walls through the video and the speaking at conferences, but even within the penal institution. The prison leadership frequently looks to him for guidance or for help with younger or new inmates who are positive. It's really an incredible example of becoming an effective advocate where one is at.
Yeah, absolutely. He's amazing, as are you, and as everyone working at the Sero project. Sean, thank you so much for now. We'll see you later for the Q&A. Oh yes, we have to give an applause. So the case of Rosemary Namaburu, the Ugandan nurse you also heard from, shocked us all. Despite being the continent with the greatest number of HIV-specific criminal laws, around 30 countries have them. Until a few years ago, prosecutions seemed to be rare across Africa. But in the past few years, we've seen an increase in prosecutions. And so to discuss this, I'm delighted to invite 2 members of the HIV Justice Network's Global Advisory Panel to the virtual sofa. So welcome, Michaela Clayton, former executive director of ARASA, the founder of ARASA, and a pioneer, if you don't mind me saying so, in feminist responses to HIV criminalization in Africa. And welcome, of course, also to Sarai Chizala Tembelhoff, a fierce human rights lawyer based in Malawi. Welcome both. So, Michaela, how did Africa end up with so many HIV criminalization laws, and what did you at ARASA do to respond to them?
Thanks, Edwin. Sorry, don't know what came over me. I'm completely emotional because of the stories that have just been shared.
It is it's emotional. You're right, Michaela.
Sorry.
Do you want to take a moment?
No, it's fine. Okay, thank you, everyone. Sorry for being such a drizzer. So in about 2004, there was a workshop that was organized in West Africa that was funded by USAID, which was supposed to come up with a model law. Stop making comments, people. You're making me cry more. Came up with a model law that was supposed to be a good practice law on HIV. But what came out of it was, in fact, a law that became known as the N'Djamena Model Law that really led to what has been known, I think Richard Elliott coined the phrase of legislative contagion. Because what happened was that people picked up on this model law, particularly in West Africa, and we ended up with a slew of laws across the continent that had specific HIV criminalization provisions that criminalized HIV transmission and exposure. So in Francophone Africa, for example, and I know Cecilia will talk about this a bit later, but there were at least 19 countries that had HIV-specific laws, of which at least 16 had a specific provision on criminalization. And in Southern and East Africa, the majority of countries have either HIV-specific laws that have criminal provisions or general laws that are applied in the context of criminalization of HIV. And so at ARASA, this was kind of early days. It was 2004, and I think we became very, concerned about the stories that started coming out about these laws that had been put in place. And what was interesting at the time was that a lot of the support for these laws was coming from women's organizations, and it was understandable in a way, because it was women who who were becoming infected in relationships where they were not able to enforce safer sex decisions because of gender dynamics and gender inequality within relationships, and felt quite powerless, I think, about being able to protect themselves. And so there was a lot of support for this law from women's organizations. And ARASA then organized a meeting in South Africa, also I think it was in 2004, early 2005, where we got a whole bunch of people together, women's organizations, people living with HIV, very diverse group of people, to really unpack what HIV criminalization meant or means. And it was one of those, those meetings you remember where there are these significant light bulb moments where as people started unpacking, what does criminalization mean for women? What does HIV criminalization mean for women? You just suddenly started seeing these light bulbs flash. And it was, well, actually, in the first place, women and girls are disproportionately vulnerable to HIV infection in the first place. But then they're also disproportionately impacted by criminalization because they're often the first to know their status. They are blamed by their intimate partners for bringing HIV into the relationship, get evicted from the home, ostracized, lose their inheritance, lose their children, and often are the first to be prosecuted because they are the first to know. And if you look at the most recent prosecutions across Southern Africa, certainly Southern and East Africa, what is very disturbing is that there's a trend of prosecutions now against women who have, for breastfeeding, women who are positive who are breastfeeding, and which is just completely, completely outrageous. And so, so the work has sort of started in about 2004, but sort of grew across the region. And Sarai is one of the people, my co-couch sitter, virtual couch sitter. Sarai is one of the people who really was really, really instrumental in supporting women in Malawi to advocate for the removal of the criminalization provisions in the Malawi law, for example. So we're beginning. Sorry. Yes.
Yeah, no. Mikhaila, that's a great lead into actually to a clip that we have from the last Beyond Blame, where you and Sarai talked about feminist responses, and Sarai shared this incredible story of advocacy in Malawi.
The feminist response to this push to criminalize was a mixed one, because a lot of women supported what they thought to be were protections. We realized that a lot of what they fought for and thought of as being protective were actually the very provisions that were then going to be used to incarcerate women, to prosecute women. We sat with grassroots networks of women living with HIV and took them through the proposed law, literally provision by provision. And at the end of that, they then took it up because it was clear to them how this would play out in the reality of their lives, because they are the ones who are who fall pregnant, who are tested, whether they like it or not, when they show up at the antenatal clinic, and therefore would be the first ones to know about their status and would have that knowledge of their status used in a legal sense as a sign of their liability under those the very transmission provisions that they thought of as being protections that they were fighting for. It took that legal empowerment aspect. It took giving people the knowledge, the understanding of the law in ways that they could then use it. And then we took a back seat. And the rest of the whole conversation was driven by the women who said to these parliamentarians, there was people there saying to them that, look, this is very important because we need to protect the unborn. We must protect the unborn from HIV. And this one woman I'll never forget, she stood up and said, before you care about the baby in my womb, I care about the baby in my womb. Mm-hmm. I care. And that was it. They spoke such truth to power in ways that can only be done, I think, by the collaboration across sectors, across classes, across races. I see that picture there. That was a group of women living with HIV. They put together those posters by themselves. A lot of those posters are talking about my body, my right. They spontaneously put together a song that was against this one tricky provision that remained in the bill, Section 43. And anytime that the parliamentarians would talk about how this is so important and this is so necessary, they would just stand up and start singing and say no to Section 43. And that was it. Section 43 was deleted.
Wow.
So it was them. It was them.
That's so amazing still to hear that story, Sarai. But I'd really love to find out what's happened since. I mean, that law did have other protective aspects. Did it make a difference having the protective provisions still in this law that got passed?
Thanks for having me on, Edwin, and it's so good to be on this virtual couch with you. And Michaela, thanks for passing on the crying bug, because now I'm in my feels.
If I could only pass tissues on.
Yeah, I know. It's just such powerful work, and it remains so critical and so important. And every time when you hear from people whose lives have been so deeply and fundamentally affected by HIV criminalization, you are reminded that there is no time to stop. And to hear from Michaela and using the resources that you provide about more recent criminalizations, again, mainly involving women, for being mothers, mothers living with HIV, it's really devastating. I took the opportunity when we last talked and when I knew I was going to be on here to follow up with some of the women that were a part of the amazing process of bringing about change and ensuring that the then bill and now law wasn't passed with the inclusion of actually it was HIV specific transmission offenses. And I asked them, well, what has happened since? Because you need to be close to the ground to understand what is happening on the ground. You need to find out from people who are living this reality. And they said to me that, as a matter of fact, we are using the law, but in interesting ways. It's not in courts, it is in the communities with the traditional leaders. And so when women or people living with HIV experience some form of discrimination, they are discussing the law and the protections that the law provides with the traditional leaders. They aren't taking it as far as criminal processes, which is how our law was set up. So every breach is accompanied by a criminal provision, and the sanctions are mainly 5 years or a fine. But they aren't taking it that far. They are rather using restorative justice methods at the community level. And so this is a first for me to hear about this, but it's definitely something that I'm going to be following up on, because I am inspired to know that despite the fight that we had and this law coming into being, really, that there's some good that is coming out of it, that there is some use that is coming out of it, that there's something tangible that people can hold on to from that law.
That's great to hear, Sarai. Thanks so much. The idea of restorative justice is something that we absolutely need to explore much more in the future. I'm afraid to say, though, that we've run out of time for this segment of on the virtual sofa. It's been wonderful to have you. If you've got any questions, though, for Michaela or Sarai, or just want to send virtual hugs and love, you can ask them. You can ask these questions in the Zoom Q&A, or if you're watching live on Facebook, you can comment under the live stream. So Michaela and Sarai will be back later to answer some of these questions, but for now, thank you both very much indeed. And the applause.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. So Another region that's been hit really hard by HIV criminalization is Eastern Europe and Central Asia. Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine all have high numbers of unjust cases, and both laws and policing across the region are impacting women and people who use drugs the most. So let's hear about what's going on from two of the most amazing advocates I know working in the region. So a very warm welcome to Sasha Volgina from the Global Network of People Living with HIV and Sveta Moraz from the Eurasian Women's Network on AIDS. Great to have you on the virtual sofa. So Sasha, let's start with you. You joined GMP Plus a couple of years ago after working on harm reduction and treatment access in your home country of Russia. When did HIV criminalization become an issue? When were you aware of it as an issue for you?
Well, basically, when I was based in my region, I didn't realize everything is so bad. So it was when I joined the GNP Plus, basically, and started to work on that. And the thing is that a lot of great activists and people in HIV, they still don't understand the reality. The reality is, after 40 years of the response, where people are going to jail just because they're HIV positive and they were having sex. So it just, in the majority of the countries in my region, in ECA region, we have old Soviet laws, which have this spotlight, which is putting into risk of HIV infection. It means you can be a husband and wife, you can have children, you can do whatever. So that was what was happening in Belarus. 300 people got into prison. You are putting somebody into risk of HIV infection. It doesn't matter, are you taking ARVs, are you using condoms, if anyone knew about that, all that doesn't matter. You just go to jail because you are putting somebody into risk. And it also means that you are criminal from the very beginning. I was signing that paper. Do you remember yourself when you were getting the HIV diagnosis? I do. I was in deep shock. I didn't realize what I'm signing, what this paper is about. But basically, as soon as I signed it, I became a criminal because it means that then you will have a responsibility and you will go to jail and you can do nothing about that. So it's just very important, to really understand that it is happening in the reality. It is happening in the whole region and we have to do something around that.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And one of the reasons that we know so much at HIV Justice Worldwide about what's going on in the region is because of Sveta and her organization and an incredible regional network of women living with HIV. We have seen so many unjust prosecutions across the region. So who is getting prosecuted and why? And why are women so vulnerable to criminalization?
Hello everyone, I'm really proud to be in such international company, such dedicated people. In 2017 we conducted community-based research run by and led by women, and it was conducted in 7 countries of Eastern Europe and Central Asia. And unfortunately we collected many cases on HIV criminalization, and most of them in Russia and Belarus. Also, we got cases from Moldova, Georgia, Uzbekistan, Estonia, and of course we were shocked on how it's impacted our region, and also we were shocked on how our community is silent about this. So we have no regret that we need to raise our voice about criminalization, because the cases from Belarus, as Sasha mentioned before, it was really like people for long years living together, love together, raising their children, and just because police officer decided to to have better the documentation and to get some records in his resume,
They had incentives, yes.
Yeah, and it was really shocking for us. And we decided to strengthen our advocacy work around HIV criminalization and to raise community awareness about this, to receive more dedicated advocates for this. And finally, based on this community research, we receive evidence on how HIV criminalization impacted on our lives.
And why women? Why are women so vulnerable? Because also, we've heard about breastfeeding prosecutions in Africa. We know that they're also happening in your region, as well as the potential exposure prosecutions. Why is that?
Yeah, it's many reasons for this, starting from gender stereotypes and gender inequality, and it's double in even multiple vulnerabilities of women. If we talking about economical reasons, if we're talking about cultural, for instance, in Central Asia, women very much dependent on their husband and their families. They don't have rights to protect themselves, and even they need to ask permission or go to hospitals. If they are widows and have sex, if they are unmarried and have sex, it's equal to sex work for them. And of course, it's stigma because of drug use, which is also, we have a huge marginalized populations having HIV. It's people who use drugs. And for women, it's again, it's a double stigma because of HIV and drug use, and even multiple stigma if they sex workers. So it's like our society perceives that we need to be a good mothers, we need to follow in gender's norms, we need to not be so active and proactive in demanding our rights. And under the pressure of all these stereotypes and with stigma and discrimination related to HIV, women put in very vulnerable position. And again, it's very important access to justice, and women don't have skills, don't have support, and don't have resources to demand for their rights. And of course, they have very low knowledge for this. In this regard, it's very important peer-to-peer support and support of community-based organization where women can believe and trust their problems and find solution together with other community of women living with HIV and women dedicated to human rights protection.
Yeah, absolutely, Sveta. Absolutely. Legal literacy, empowerment, those are really important things for all people, and especially for women in your region living with HIV. But despite all of the punitive laws and the draconian regimes under which many people living with HIV live in your region, there have been some successes. You've both mentioned Belarus. It was the country that had the highest per capita number of prosecutions, but there has been some success in law reform. Can you tell us about it?
Yes, sure. So in Belarus, yeah, it was nightmare. It was really nightmare. And also, I think it's important to understand I was making quite a lot of interviews with the survivors, with those who were in prison. And you have to understand what is the impact on treatment and testing as well. Because what the people, when I was asking them, what you would do differently, they were saying, those who had money, they were saying, we would order from India the ARVs. We would never go to the treatment facilities. Those who didn't have money, they were saying, we would prefer to die rather than to go to treatment facilities, get tested, and then go to prison. So we just have to understand what was going on there. It wasn't easy at all. We were working together very hard with People Plus, with Yevna. Also, we've been supported quite, I can say the support was really huge from the side of UNAIDS and country office, from WHO that was supporting. Guys were working a lot with the prosecutor's office. They were working a lot with the community itself, trying to prevent the cases, trying to describe to the people what to say to police, what not to say to police, also this prevention. They became excellent street lawyers, I can say. They're really very good in that now. This is the picture of them standing behind the court. They were coming to the courts, defending people. They're saying now that we are like perfect lawyers already. So at the same time, they were advocating really very hard towards government and towards the parliament. So in 2019, the legislation was changed, but let's be clear, it's not a total win. So we changed one part, just one part of the law. Now it says that if you have informed the person you have HIV, you won't be convicted. That's it, all the rest is still there. So of course, the people who were convicted under that part, they are now releasing from the prisons. But those who were not, they're still there. So there's quite a lot of work still to do. And we're now trying to find the other approaches. I believe Sveta will tell a bit more about that, about the the approaches we're using also to fight that. And still we're still on the go, the advocacy is still needed.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, there is so much more to do. Would you be able to just tell us quickly, Sveta, in about a minute, some of the actions that you're doing in the region to try and improve things around HIV criminalization?
First of all, we providing technical assistance and support for community groups who have intention, willingness, and capacity to advocate, to monitor, and to prove, to collect evidence against of the harm of HIV criminalization. So we support community group in Belarus, in Ukraine, in Tajikistan, and other advocates, sometimes even lawyers who provide direct support in the court for our people. And we also want to integrate HIV criminalization issues in all CEDAW report our community members submit. For instance, HIV criminalization was included in the last CEDAW report submitted by Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Ukraine women leaders. And for us, it's like integration and mainstreaming HIV criminalization issue in the women's organization agenda. And for our, it's big victory. Also, now we have a new, direction to collect gender disaggregated data. We want to understand on how HIV criminalization impacted on our women. And for instance, we receive such disaggregated by sex data from Ukraine and Russia. And for Ukraine, for instance, we've got that, and that data demonstrates for the period from 2015 to 2018, only women in Ukraine was prosecuted by the Article 130 of Criminal Code in Ukraine. And when I'm trying to explore the last cases, for instance, the last one, it was Sumskaya Oblast. It's a rural area of Ukraine, and women has been persecuted by not by the part 1, by the part 4, and only for biting police officer. And I was really shocked that in 2018 in Ukraine, women living with HIV is prosecuted for biting police officer. And yeah,
so
it's really shocking.
It is shocking. But the thing that is perhaps even more shocking to people watching is that cases of people being prosecuted for spitting and biting, police officers and others, actually make up about a quarter of the cases that we monitor around the world. It is absolutely shocking that in this day and age, when spit can't transmit, it's just not, it's the work you're doing is amazing. But I'm afraid that's all we have time for. Sasha and Sveta will be back later to answer some of the questions for now, but really thank you both. It's a pleasure working with you. And here's some applause for you.
Thanks a lot, Edwin.
Okay, bye. So you can see there's a theme going on here. Leadership of people living with HIV, network empowerment, linking the local to the regional, to the global and back again. And we're going to see now what a difference this is making in Mexico and across Francophone Africa when we meet my next guests. So welcome Gonzalo Alberto from the Sero Project and Cecilia Cheung from the Canadian HIV/AIDS Legal Network. So Gonzalo, you and I first met a few years ago when HIV Justice Worldwide helped support the creation of the Mexican Network Against HIV Criminalization. Before I come to you, let's look at a short film documenting how it all started.
In October 2017, the first Spanish-language HIV is not a crime meeting took place in Mexico City.
Yo creo que esta reunión es inédita en México porque por primera vez organizaciones de la sociedad civil nos sentamos a pensar, a discutir y a conocer el impacto de la criminalización en nuestro país.
Participants learned about HIV criminalization around the world, the global movement to end HIV criminalization, and the importance of the leadership of people living with HIV networks.
Prior to me coming here, I didn't really understand criminalization and how it really implicates on the lives of persons living with HIV. And I think that's an issue that we need to work worldwide and especially in our region of Latin America and the Caribbean.
After analysing the legal situation across Mexico, strategizing to come up with solutions, and passionate discussions, by the meeting's end, participants rolled up their sleeves and created the 11-point Mexican Declaration Against HIV Criminalization.
Bueno, yo lo mínimo que esperaría que saliera de este foro es que pudiésemos crear una red mexicana en contra de la criminalización, que trabajáramos de manera coordinada en todo el país.
And they wasted no time getting their message out. Incredibly, 2 weeks later, at a meeting with key Quintana Roo lawmakers, network representatives presented the declaration to Congresswoman Laura Beristain, who last year pushed for a new, unjust, overly broad HIV criminal law. The result? A firm commitment to repeal Quintana Roo's problematic HIV law. Congratulations to the new Mexican network, an inspiration to everyone fighting HIV-related injustice.
So Gonzalo, that's amazing. That was 3 years ago. And since then, I know that the Mexican Network's gone on to do some more incredible work. What's happened since?
Thank you for having me here. And it's really something very special for me having this conversation with all of my colleagues and all of the people that we work in the HIV Justice Network, and especially in Sero project. And I just want to tell you that after that, we have our second national meeting last year with the representation of 13 states from Mexico and 45 organizations. And the most important things has been the lobby work that the Mexican network has done regarding the intention of criminalizing HIV people in Mexico City, and also sexual workers. That the first one, the HIV intention of criminalizing people with HIV in Mexico City was was held and was put out from the congressional conversations in Mexico City Congress. And the other one about sexual workers are still pending because the situation that we are facing with the COVID. Also, the most other important issue is that the network has been working in the criminalization of COVID-19. And that's something very important because just this past June 30, in the Mexican state of Nuevo León, which is in the north part of the country, has approved legislation that criminalizes people who transfer an illness. Is for COVID, but doesn't mention COVID or HIV. And with our experience, we are looking that mostly all these legislations are intended to criminalize and not just COVID, but HIV as well. And also, the point is that the penalty is 10 years in prison. And this legislation is already on, and the Mexican network with the Commission of Human Rights in Mexico, they are working to present the appeal at the Supreme Court. And also the other important thing that the Mexican network has done is work with the lack of drugs that was a result from the new policy of the Mexican government. And especially during last year was a very, very bad lack of drugs for people who is living with HIV. And basically, those are the main issues. And we are continuing to working in the situation of the penal codes in the Mexican Republic, because every state had different penal codes, and they use that legislation to criminalize people with who live with HIV, and basically that's one of the main issues that we are working on.
Thanks so much, Gonzalo. I mean, what's clear is that the work that was started focusing on HIV criminalization is now much broader, that the network is established, and obviously anything that impacts key populations and people living with HIV is something that the Mexican network is working on. If you hang on a sec, I'm going to talk to Cecile, and then I'll come back to you in a moment. So Cecile, welcome. So you work, of course, for the Canadian HIV/AIDS Legal Network, but you've also been HIV Justice Worldwide's Francophone Africa Regional Coordinator since we began in 2016. Can you share with us some of the examples of how the Francophone Network has galvanized around HIV criminalization?
Yeah, thank you very much, Edwin, and hi to everyone. Thank you for having me. Yeah, I'm very happy to tell you about the Francophone network. Basically, it exists since 2017, and it is composed of human rights and HIV advocates from around like 14 different countries, mainly in Francophone Africa. And the purpose of this network is really to make sure that there is a space for those Francophone activists to actually learn, exchange experience and resources on HIV criminalization, but also to build bridges with other colleagues and activists around the world, you know, in a way to overcome the language barriers. And this is really what HIV Justice Worldwide is about. And I think this is really important to ensure that HIV criminalization remains on the radar of HIV activists in the region, especially in Francophone Africa, where we heard from Michaela that many HIV laws that are meant to protect people living with HIV actually have provision criminalizing people living with HIV. And where even if we haven't seen many prosecution, or maybe we just don't know about them, this is a real threat. So it's really important that those HIV advocates, you know, are part of the global conversation and that we can support them.
Absolutely. So I know there's been a number of successes. We don't have a lot of time to talk about them, but the main thing that I think people need to understand is that we now have this incredible Francophone Africa advocacy fact sheet that you co-authored with Alain Kha. And it's the first of many that we're hoping to publish that are focused on a particular region and language. Can you tell us a little bit about it, Cecile?
Yeah, so this info sheet is really to make sure that there is resources that are made by Francophone for Francophone on HIV criminalization, and that really touch on the arguments that are, you know, useful for people working in the region of Francophone Africa. And it also includes some examples of how local advocates have done advocacy on HIV criminalization in the region. And just wanted to add on that point that we do support local advocacy through HIV Justice Worldwide, and including recently in Burkina Faso and DRC. And so you'll let me know if there is enough time to talk about this, but just to reinforce that we do provide support to local advocates.
Absolutely, Cecile. Unfortunately, there isn't enough time to talk about it now, but maybe that's one of the things that we can that people can ask you about during the Q&A. Before we go, Gonzalo, I know that you have a message you'd like to give to your fellow advocates in Latin America, Caribbean, many of whom I know are on the webinar right now. In 30 seconds, what would you like to say?
Please join us for this movement. It's very important. We know that in Latin America there is cases, but we don't have them. And please contact me and contact Sero or contact any other colleague in HIV Justice Network worldwide. We will answer you, but it's very, very critical for us to have the information that what is happening in the Caribbean and in the rest of the region in Latin America. Please send us your email of your organization, or even if you are not in one, join us in this struggle. It's very, very, very crucial and important. And we are facing this together, and we will have to work together. Thank you, Edwin.
Thanks, Gonzalo, and thanks, Cecile. So obviously we'd hoped to be together all in Mexico City, and we would have had a special focus in Spanish for Latin American Caribbean people. But anyway, for now, I really want to thank you, Gonzalo and Cecile. If you have any questions for them or for any previous guests, you can ask them in the Zoom Q&A, or if you're watching live on Facebook, you can comment under the live stream. But for now, Gonzalo and Cecile, you get a round of applause. Thank you so much. So now it's time to expand our virtual sofa as I welcome 3 guests. All of them are Global Advisory Panel members for the HIV Justice Network, and of course, not only that, but leaders in their respective communities. So welcome, Cecilia Cheung from the Transgender Law Center in San Francisco. Cecilia is an internationally recognized leader in the transgender and PLHIV movements, founded Positively Trans, and is also chair of the Sero project. Jules, hi Jules. Jules came from the Scarlet Alliance, the Australian Sex Workers Association. She's also chair of the Asia Pacific Network of Sex Workers. Welcome, Jules. And there's Ellie Balan from M Coalition, a fantastic LGBT and HIV activist based in Beirut in Lebanon. Welcome all three of you. It's great to have you, and thanks also for being on the Global Advisory Panel. So let's start with you, Cecilia. What do we know about transgender people and HIV criminalization? How do those identities intersect?
Well, thank you for asking that really important question, Edwin. I think that the truth is we don't really know enough about how HIV criminalization impact transgender people living with HIV because across the world, it is not uniformly collected in terms of the data. And so a lot of times, even when we know for sure that there are criminalization happening, but the numbers still remain invisible.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's very important that the work that we do in finding cases, counting. If you can't find the cases, you can't advocate on behalf of the people who are being prosecuted and criminalized. And so let's move over to you, Jules, for a second. Sex work is criminalized pretty much everywhere, but what does that mean for sex workers who are also living with HIV?
Yeah, it's extremely unfortunate because what does happen as well, even in cases where sex work might not be criminalised, is that you find that sex workers are often targeted for criminalisation, and even where HIV criminalisation has been repealed in certain countries, there'll still be laws that target sex workers, like, for example, in Australia. Where for some reason there seems to be this perception that if you exchange money for sex, that creates a greater risk for HIV transmission.
Absolutely crazy. Ellie, let's quickly just turn to you in the MENA region. Of course, there's so many different kinds of punitive laws impacting all of the key populations. But is HIV criminalization also an issue in your region?
Well, the thing is that HIV is not criminalized instantly, but it's usually used as part of other laws criminalizing men who have sex with men, transgender people, sex workers, and drug users. And usually they come back to colonial laws that usually go around what is unnatural. And this is where the debate is up to whoever judge is present in a courtroom. And they usually go around issues of debauchery, morality, and religion. So there's nothing specific on health or transmission, but you can use whatever law and just use the HIV as extra evidence to increase penalties and criminalization of people.
Mm.
There are so many, it seems to me there's so many common threads, and HIV 2020 is all about key populations reclaiming the response. So how do we figure out how we work together to do that? All the different key populations living with HIV, impacted by HIV, when we're talking about HIV criminalization, but of course it's so much more. Jules, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, sure. I think there's a really good example, recent example of that in the case of CJ Palmer in Australia. And CJ is a trans woman sex worker of colour who was charged with grievous bodily harm for allegedly, infecting her partner There was lots of really stigmatizing discourse and stigmatizing media around that, like, this kind of perception that the person was a client because obviously a sex worker couldn't have a relationship, and particularly in these cases where you see situations where it comes down to kind of these respectability politics. And I think that's an inherent issue with HIV cases. It's, so people that kind of fall outside these mainstream notions of acceptability don't really get a chance at a fair trial. So if you are somebody that is more blameworthy, I guess, in the eyes of the public, it kind of plays out in these really problematic ways. What was really positive, and all the really negative things and it was a real eye-opener for me as well, being involved in that case, because it was like being back in the 80s, like for in terms of the general population and the justice system and their perception of what HIV is and what it means and who sex workers are. And what was incredibly positive was when, unfortunately, she received an extremely harsh sentence in a maximum security male prison. We did appeal that sentence. And so organisations came together, including, the other sex worker organisations, the National Association for People Living with HIV, and MSM organisations and trans organisations, and recognising that this was a really problematic issue. And we put together, there was a lot of joint advocacy. NAPWA and Scarlet Alliance put together an amicus brief, and we were successful in getting the sentence reduced. Which meant was it was problematic in the first place that she was charged, but at least we managed to get the sentence reduced and her out of prison.
Absolutely. There's still so much that needs to be done, though, of course, around educating the criminal justice system, the media, the public, all of that. Cecilia, does the story of CJ ring true to you? Do you have any experiences, examples of how you and the Transgender Law Centre have supported trans people living with HIV in these difficult circumstances?
Well, the story of CJ definitely rang true, and I had been following that story for a while now, since it happened. I think that, like I mentioned earlier, there are a lot of invisibilities in terms of HIV-specific criminalizations against the trans community. But I think that if we look at the HIV-related criminalization, such as, being criminalized for sex works, and then, get slapped on some HIV enhancement, those are the things that we are still trying to work on, uncovering. One of the things that we are working with, in terms of trying to really change the criminal justice systems and also challenge some of these irrational laws is really, taking a harm reduction approach. For instance, in the US, there are some states that still have what they call the crimes against the nature law. For instance, in Louisiana, they just repealed that law, but what they didn't do was to take that law actually off the book. So folks who have been previously, arrested and charged with sex for crime against nature law, they still have to register as sex offenders, even though that, there will not be any further prosecution. So these are catch-22. You go one step forward and then two step backs. And I think until we really can change, like Jules mentioned, that how people talk about HIV, how people talk about key populations, and how people talk about, HIV criminalizations, and really go with the science instead of, some moral judgment. There's a lot that we still need to do.
There still is, absolutely, Cecilia. Although there was some success in California, you mentioned sentence enhancements, and I think the law in California was modernized and changed to remove those.
Yes, that's correct. And actually, in addition to California, there are some other states like Colorado, Iowa. They all have been able to successfully reform some of these like HIV criminalization laws to really look at reducing them from felonies to misdemeanor. I mean, the goal, of course, is to get them off the book completely.
Absolutely, yes, absolutely. So, Ellie, there are so many issues, of course, to deal with in your region. But what is M Coalition doing to try and build alliances and end all the kinds of criminalization that's going on?
So one of the main things, and Jules and Cecilia were just talking about it, is the education. Because even if you try to change the laws, there's an issue. Because let's say I go into Parliament with a draft law and I'm trying to remove it, but then what happens within the Parliament, the discussion might not go in our favor. And instead of decreasing or decriminalizing, we end up with more severe punishments or more specific laws. And most of the laws that we have that are used are intentional murder. So this goes back to actually saying that HIV is deadly, which brings us back to so many years of regression of what HIV does and what it is. So there's a lot of education that needs to be happening. And this is a lot what we are doing. Visibility is a very important aspect for us, for our communities and for the trans community, for example, as well. We've seen a lot of examples in the media and protests where trans individuals are really vigilant and they're expressive. And this has caused a lot of conversation, not always a positive conversation in society, but visibility is the first step for us to move closer to better services and reducing criminalization. And I think the main thing we're doing is we're creating a lot of studies and needs assessment around different community needs to try and see, to identify the basic needs, and moreover to identify individuals who we are able to build their capacity on advocacy around law, around criminalization, so they are able to voice out their own communities. And I think one of the main things that we also did was we created a portal around HIV services where you can just find them like a Yelp kind of thing, and you can rate the services, rate how friendly they are. And this year we're adding where people can find legal services specific to different kinds of criminalization, so they know where to go to in case they need support. And re-echoing education, we were the first ones to create the U=U campaign in Arabic because a lot of the regional networks are still very scared of actually saying to people that, if you're undetectable, you're not going to transmit the virus. And I think this is a huge step in the fight against HIV criminalization, that we actually educate people on different elements of HIV, of transmission, of living with HIV, as a healthy and integrated member of society.
Ellie, that's fantastic, and really that segues so well into our next segment. But for now, really, this is such a rich conversation. I know we could go on longer. Hopefully, be able to ask questions later on when we're in the Q&A section. But for now, thank you, Cecilia, Jules, and Ellie. And here's some applause for you. So, yes, education around science, that seems to be, the up-to-date understanding of HIV seems to be one of the ways that we are finding ways to get through to lawmakers and the criminal justice system. Is science the solution? This is what I'm going to be discussing with my final two guests on the virtual sofa. So welcome, Sally Cameron. You're, of course, the Senior Policy Analyst for the HIV Justice Network, a close colleague, and you're based near Brisbane, Australia. And to Alex McClelland, incoming Critical Criminology Assistant Professor at Carleton University in Ottawa, Canada, and also a member of our Global Advisory Panel. Welcome, both of you. So, Sally, 2 years ago at a press conference at AIDS 2018, where you can see some familiar faces, we launched the Global Expert Consensus Statement on the Science of HIV in the Context of Criminal Law. It was authored by 20 of the biggest names in HIV science and endorsed by another 70 global experts. It provides clarity on HIV-related risk, harm and proof issues that lawmakers and the criminal justice system have been struggling with ever since the first criminalization laws and prosecutions. So this week we published a scoping report that you undertook, Sally, to examine what impact that statement's been having. So has the expert consensus statement actually brought science to justice?
Well, it has been a privilege really to undertake the scoping study because what it's shown, it was a quick piece of work because we didn't want to pour a lot of resources into looking backwards, but really what we found is it met its two main objectives, which is that it is a useful document to be used in court for the defence, but also it's been really instrumental in leading advocacy around law reform and a whole lot of other things. So we found out that, for example, the statement has been used successfully as part of the Colombian constitutional challenge around how the breadth, the overbreadth of their laws, the overreach of the laws, and how they were really inequitable and not what laws are supposed to be doing. There are current challenges in Uganda, in Kenya, and there's a current case in Canada around use of condoms. There's a case in Lesotho around use of the death penalty in relation to sexual assault. So we know it is being used in courts. We also know it's been used in a range of really fantastic, inspirational ways in just countries around the world. And that's really been the great joy of being a part of this process, is that community organisations in different countries have taken the statement and they have run with it. So, for example, in Morocco, the statement has been used by ALCS. They have taken it, they have met with prosecutors, they have met with magistrates, with police, and explained the science and why prosecutions are the wrong way to go. And it really backed up the process, their process backed up ours, which was to reach out and get endorsers from more than 70 countries. Senior scientific experts from more than 17 countries endorsed the statement, 2 of them from Morocco and also involved with the organisation. But what that communicates is this means something where we are. It means something in Morocco. Sveta and Sasha talked about the great changes that have started in Belarus, where it was really important as part of the law reform there, which, was about stopping prosecutions of an HIV positive person in a relationship, possibly married, where both partners agreed to sexual relations, possibly using whatever kind of prevention that, they thought was best for them. The HIV negative partner not wanting someone to be prosecuted, but the police pursuing them regardless. And I think the great thing about that situation is the retrospectivity around it, that there's now a review of people, and people are being released from jail to go back to their family, including often their children. So I'm going to whiz through a couple. We've got law reform happening in Zimbabwe. In the Czech Republic, they had it translated themselves, took it to public health, who've endorsed it. In Canada, as I said, there's been a whole lot of progress around recommendation for prosecutorial guidelines and recommendations from a parliamentary committee that there be no prosecutions without transmission. And just lastly, I wanted to mention in Burkina Faso, where it's really been used to engage with religious and customary leaders who wanted to know what the evidence is. And really the argument there is the science doesn't support prosecution, and that there's no evidence these laws are effective, have helped bring them into the community mobilisation strategy for law reform. So yeah, the scoping was great. Really enjoyed the exercise.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it really is incredible. I mean, and so much kudos to you, Sally, for being the wind beneath the wings of the original, of helping the 20 expert authors pull the statement together. But this figuring out what impact it's had over the last couple of years is really remarkable. Thank you for that. And so Alex, let's talk to you for a second. So, I mean, one of the areas covered in the expert consensus statement is the issue of forensics, attempting to prove through science that one person actually infected another. Now, there's a lot of misunderstanding about this technique that's called phylogenetic analysis. But the statement makes it very clear that this technique isn't reliable enough to show who infected who on an individual level. But that same technology is being used for public health purposes, including for so-called molecular HIV surveillance. So why is this a concern, and how does it fit in with HIV criminalization?
Sure. Thank you so much for this, Edwin, and thank you so much for having me. It's really inspiring to be connected to all of these activists around the world, and really emotional and beautiful. Molecular HIV surveillance is a concern because it has been developed and being deployed in countries that are leading in HIV criminalization around the world. So specifically in Canada and in the US, it's been developed as a public health surveillance mechanism, and it's being done without consent, without patient consent. So it's done during routine testing. They take our blood. I'm living with HIV. They take your blood during routine testing for resistance, and then they use that as a secondary purpose for HIV public health surveillance. And they can do advanced things in a laboratory, which we don't have time to get into here about the science of it. But basically, they can establish in pretty much real time where higher rates of infections are happening or new transmissions are taking place. And this is being used now around the world for HIV research. There's a study in Milan, there's some in South Africa, but it's also being instituted into the public health programs or public health infrastructure in certain countries, specifically the US and in parts of Canada. And one of the concerning things is that while researchers are saying, or specifically in the consensus statement, we're saying that phylogenetic analysis should not be used to prove directionality of transmission. Scientists are trying to work to do this. They're really interested in the idea that they can prove that one person gave HIV to one other person, and they have been able to do it in highly controlled settings. And so I think this is a concern for us, because if in a laboratory, scientists can determine who gave HIV to who, in countries where HIV criminalization is very much an issue, how could that information be repurposed? And so there's real issues around privacy, confidentiality, and consent that are being raised by communities. So you've shown here a group of people living with HIV and researchers responded to one of the big studies that took place in LA looking at trans women. And one of the things that I think is a concern for people in the community that this study highlighted was not only are there consent and criminalization concerns, because we don't know how this data is going to be shared and what are the privacy oversights with this data, but at the same time, they're doing this research disconnected from community. So there's public health researchers in a laboratory looking at the sex lives of trans women, trying to figure out who they're having sex with. And one of the number one concerns, or one of the things that we raised in this response into the Lancet, was if you actually spoke with trans women and actually engaged with trans women, you wouldn't need to do this study, because one of the main findings from that study was, shocker, trans women have sex with straight men, which if you know any trans women, you know that's probably the case, as well as other people. And so I think that was one of the concerns, is this research even necessary? It's violating the rights of people living with HIV. They're taking our blood and using it in ways that we don't have any knowledge of to enact forms of surveillance and control over our lives, and it's a concern.
So Alex, when you presented on your work, and there's been many of us actually involved in HIV Justice Worldwide and associated colleagues who've been concerned about this now for a couple of years. When you talked about it in our strategy meeting, we decided to make it a priority for HIV Justice Worldwide this year. It's very scary to hear just how our blood is being used without our consent. So I'd like to ask both of you, though, how do we, as community advocates, better engage with, build bridges with those who are working in public health and in science, you know, those scientists who want to improve phylogenetics so it's foolproof? How do we do that? How do we bring justice to science?
I think it's a good question, and it's been one of the very interesting side effects, really, of the process of developing the expert consensus statement, because although we were aiming for a particular document and we weren't really focused
on the development of relationships. So that developing that statement took basically, it took more than a year and involved numerous interactions with people. And so I don't know, in the building of those relationships, I guess, and the conversations we had was the development of some trust. I must say, though, I think back to the initial conversations and how absolutely incredulous most of those scientists were when we gave them the basics of HIV criminalization, who was being prosecuted and why, because they just thought the whole thing was extraordinary and couldn't believe that it was actually going on. So in those conversations, since those conversations, I think we've had some great outcomes. One of them is you can pick up a phone or send an email to someone and get a quick response. That is invaluable, the breaking down of those silos. But another crucial consequence of it has really been the involvement of those scientists in our advocacy, writing affidavits for court cases and appearing as expert witnesses, co-authoring. So, it was incredible having an article in the New York Times co-authored by one of the experts, former head of the IAS, and also Robert Suttle, who is a criminalization survivor, reaching out, in an esteemed publication to a very, a broader audience than we would normally be reaching. But I think the work that that was done in the Czech Republic is also very interesting, because the community organization took the statement, organized for its translation with a clinician, took it to all the regional Czech HIV centers and got increased understanding and endorsement, took it to the Public Health Agency, got their sign-on. They have put it on their website, and they've now been able to start pursuing the development of recommendations basically from government to stop these prosecutions when the science doesn't support it. So I'm well aware, as we're talking about this, that obviously it's not all about science. It's about stigma. It's about all those things. But we know a huge number of prosecutions would not proceed if it was only in cases where HIV transmission had or even could occur. So I'll put that caveat in. But I think the work that has been done by some agencies to try to bridge that divide across the silos has been really impressive.
Thanks, Sally. I'm sorry, I'm afraid Alex, I'd love to hear what your response to the answer to question would be, but we've actually run out of time, but I'm hoping that someone's going to ask you about that in the Q&A, because we're going to see you very soon for that. So for now, thank you to Sally and Alex, and here's some applause for you. So do you have any questions for Sally, for Alex, for me, or anyone else who appeared on Virtual Sofa? You can ask them in the Zoom Q&A. If you're watching live on Facebook, you can comment under the live stream. So there have been so many brilliant minds, so much information, such an incredible array of conversations, and we're just scratching the surface. And that's why we'll soon be launching HIV Justice Live, an interactive web show similar to this one, but a little bit shorter. But on each show, we'll focus on one topic and explore it in greater detail. And so to help us figure out the topic for the first show, we'd like to ask you to choose. And so we've prepared a poll for you. Here's the poll. What do you want to know more about? And you can scroll down because there's a few answers here. Would you like to know more about the impact on women? Would you like to know more about building networks? How about all the incredible work going on in the different regions? What about how HIV criminalization intersects with the criminalization of key populations? And this most recent conversation about surveillance and science and how do we deal with all of that? I can see there's lots of people voting. We'll give you a few more seconds. The most popular answer is key populations, 49%, but close second was the issue of surveillance and science at 47%, the impacts on women. It seems everybody wants to know a lot about everything, which is great, and we'll make sure that we do that. We cover all of these topics and many more on HIV Justice Live in the future. So now I'm going to step back to join the rest of my guests on the virtual sofa, which means for this Q&A segment, I'm delighted to be handing over to my fierce and fabulous co-hosts.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Edwin, and a huge thank you to all of our panelists so far. It's been a very rich discussion with all of the panelists, and also a lot going on in the chat box. And I want to thank all of our participants for being so engaged. So as you know, there is a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You can press that button and a little box will pop up, and you can type any questions that you might have into there. You can also upvote questions that are already in there. And we're going to do our best to get to as many of your questions as we can, but there are quite a few. So we're trying to sort of organize them into themes. And for those that we don't get to specifically on today's webinar, we will try to follow up with you all and send responses to any specific questions. Paul, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, just to say that we have a great newly launched website, the HIV Justice Network website. It certainly contains a lot of in-depth information for people who do want to find more about these issues. I really encourage you to go to the website and investigate our reports and our other materials if there are background information that people want. Great.
So it's been a really fantastic conversation so far. I think, we've had some very rich themes that have come up around the important role of censoring survivors in all of our criminalization work, the importance of considering power as we do our work and bringing, a feminist critique, an anti-racist critique, contextualizing HIV criminalization within larger movements that intersect with HIV decriminalization, such as abolition, looking at the role of policing, harm reduction, reproductive justice, lots of different issues that our panelists touched on. And then also, it's been so inspiring to hear about many of the very creative interventions that have been done, from community-based research to the use of cultural work, song, in addition to using human rights mechanisms and things like that. And so we have quite a few questions to go through. I'm going to start off with a general question to our panel that came up several times in the Q&A box about how HIV criminalization and decriminalization is situated within the context of larger conversations about abolition and policing. And so there were a couple of questions here, specifically that, for example, folks who enforce the law, police, often don't need laws to discriminate against people. And there are lots of ways in which HIV criminalization intersects with different forms of policing and surveillance. So, and then we also had a question about, there's a very live, movement right now here in the US, in particular, the uprising around the role of police brutality, and the role of police more broadly. And so I want to invite any of our panelists to speak about how to really center HIV decriminalization issues within this context of larger conversations on abolition and policing. And Cecilia, do you want to speak to this, and anybody else?
Yes, I'd be happy to just briefly touch on that. I'm sure there are other experts, on this panel as well. One of the contexts, of course, with criminalization is, the fact that people get criminalized and also get imprisoned because of these criminalization laws. And it is pretty much, a big challenge that we're seeing here in the US, and also in some other countries as well. It's more than just about being discriminated, in some ways. If we look at
whom the police are really profiling, and whom these laws are being used against. Like it's a form of humiliations, of people that they would consider to be different. So like walking while trans, criminalizing immigrants, like in ICE detention facilities, and it doesn't really prevent any like HIV transmission, but instead what it does is it sentence people not to just a prison sentence, but potentially, like a death sentence. What I'm like trying to refer to here is, one of the cases that we're working on right now at Transgender Law Center, which is a wrongful death case of Roxana Hernandez, who's a Honduran trans woman who was in ICE detention, and because of the lack of care, she died because of HIV-related complications. And there's no accountability in terms of the criminal justice systems, or like any forms of like policing and any of the detention systems. So that's the first things that we want to make sure we challenge is, like to reduce these kinds of harms, by abolishing these like irrational laws that end up incarcerating people. Like we are at least, if not half a way, at least 1/3 of the way in terms of like really protecting lives of like folks that we're really trying to advocate for, such as Black lives, trans lives, and other key populations such as sex workers and gay men as well.
Thank you so much, Cecilia. Do we have one more panelist who wants to speak to this?
I'm sorry.
Gonzalo, are you going to speak?
Yes, I just want to touch base on the situation that we are facing now in this country regarding, but it's not just this country, it's all over the world. The issues that we are facing here regarding Black Lives Matter, as we know here in the US at this moment, has been also count with the participation of a lot of people who is working on HIV organizations. If you see the demonstrations in all over the country, you can see people who are doing that, because for the beginning of the movement in October, when we were struggling on those days, we know that HIV is related to everything, and every issue regarding the trans, all the situations that as minorities we are facing as gay people, Latinx people, and it's not a matter of black and white. We should remember that people who the Native American people were here before, and Mexican people were living here before the building of this country. And that's something very important. But yes, we are in the field, we are on the street, and we are protesting what is happening right now. And that's something that we need to look for it.
Thank you so much, Gonzalo. And I think that, one of the things that HIV has always surfaced is the ways that many different forms of oppression and marginalization intersect. And so we know that HIV criminalization is often really just an excuse to criminalize people for Blackness, for brownness, for transness, for having agency over our bodies in terms of how we use our bodies and how we earn income, right? And so these are just tactics. And we also know that anti-Blackness is the way that, that a racial hierarchy is constructed. And so other communities of color are also experience the consequences of anti-Blackness because of that racialized hierarchy. So thank you so much for these comments. We also see that There are particular ways in which COVID-19 criminalization is newly sweeping the globe. It's not, we're living in multiple pandemics, right? There's the COVID-19 pandemic, but there's also the pandemic of COVID-19 criminalization. And there are a lot of parallels to HIV criminalization, and HIV advocates have been very much leading the way in resisting criminalization of COVID-19 because we understand the consequences of criminalizing a health issue. And I want to turn over to my co-moderator, Paul Kidd, to frame the next set of questions here.
Yeah, thank you, Nana. This is something that's come up quite a few times in the Q&A box that people have asked questions about this. And it's obviously really topical. We're all meeting online because of the COVID-19 pandemic, and there are a lot of parallels and a lot of concerns that we have as anti-criminalisation activists for the reflex to criminalisation that we've seen around the world. So I might just ask Alex, the criminalisation of COVID-19, it's obviously very new, but what are some of the parallels and what are some of the lessons that we've learned from HIV criminalisation and how are we applying those in the response to COVID-19?
Well, I think, thank you, Paul. And just as Nana outlined, the way that the criminalization of communicable diseases and HIV, the policing and communicable diseases such as HIV and COVID manifest are run along lines of inequality in society. So the same patterns of inequality that we've seen replicated in the HIV pandemic will be reproduced in how COVID is policed and criminalized. And we're seeing that around the world. Police have been deputized and given extraordinary powers to police all aspects of society in many different ways across the world. And we've seen an upswing in terms of police power and violence. So police have murdered people in South Africa for allegedly violating COVID rules. We've seen migrant workers be sprayed with bleach in certain parts of the world. In Canada, we have 30 criminal charges pending for alleged spitting or spitting or coughing on people and related to COVID. In the United States, people coughing on people has been labeled a terroristic threat. And so there's many, in France, there's been over 1 million people who've been given fines for violating or for allegedly violating COVID restrictions. And I think it's been very concerning and but one of the things that I think is important that Nana raised is that our leading work in responding to the criminalization of HIV has helped lay the groundwork to respond and address the criminalization of COVID, despite how overwhelming and all pervasive it is around the world.
I'm happy to have any other panelists follow up, but I wonder if Jules, if you've got some thoughts about this and particularly the impact of the COVID-19 criminalisation on sex workers.
Yeah, look, it has been really difficult for sex workers, and unfortunately we have been similarly, we've seen similar patterns playing out, like who is more blameworthy, and we're seeing this kind of rush to kind of target certain populations. And we saw that play out in terms of the targeting and fining of sex workers. On one hand, sex workers not being eligible for government support packages, but on the other hand, if they're working to kind of support their families and themselves, then actually being targeted by police for huge fines that they're really not equipped to pay for. And I think that this kind of comes down to the issue of criminalisation, not just HIV criminalisation, but criminalisation of sex work, because it's not recognised as work, that we continue to be left out in terms of supportive mechanisms, and at the same time kind of targeted for what is essentially a health issue. And this has been really unfortunate, and we've seen this play out in really negative ways. And you would think that over many, many years, the lessons that we've learnt in the HIV response about the negative impact of criminalisation on public health would have been learnt, but it seems to be kind of replicating in the responses to COVID.
Unless there's someone else who wants to speak on that particular issue, or particularly, the other kind of parallel issue is about policing and about the role of police in enforcing these kinds of laws, which I think the police have always been so involved in the enforcement of HIV criminalisation laws, but it's very visible now when we see police on the streets enforcing lockdowns and enforcing social distancing around the world, that we see that the role of the police in enforcing those things. So if there's anyone, perhaps Cecile or another panellist who has some comments about that aspect of this issue.
Thank you, Paul. Yes, I think that we need to be careful, because indeed, like, police is not really well suited to deal with public health issues, and so this is a concern that we see in the COVID response, and that's a lesson that we've learned from HIV criminalization. Also, how lack of understanding from police or members of the judiciary generally about the impact of criminalization on public health, but also a lack of understanding of the science can lead to really misapplication of the law and great injustice. So this is something that we need to bring forward and look after, for sure.
Could I say something too? Thanks. I mean, so obviously, COVID-19 is the elephant in the room, and I think it's the biggest threat to all of us in terms of our organizing, our advocacy, along with the person who's currently in the US White House. So vote for Biden if you're in the United States. But it's also potentially an opportunity, I think, because I think, everybody has lost some liberties. Obviously, due to COVID-19, everyone at some point has dealt with the draconian laws and policies, and governments just not knowing what they're doing by passing laws, and by police who are just have no clue what they're doing and how to implement it. Obviously, the fault lines of the most vulnerable and marginalized people has been exposed even more with COVID too. So everyone suffers, but the key populations, people who are most vulnerable, are suffering even more. But I think that might also be an opportunity in our work to highlight just how useless criminal laws are, how problematic policing is. And so I think more people now than ever understand that criminal laws are doing far more harm than good for anything that's a public health issue, that's a health issue. And that perhaps this is an opportunity to use this experience to really advocate against ending all kinds of punitive responses, and the broader criminal justice system, the broader policing, over-policing, overzealous policing of communities. I think it is an opportunity as well as obviously an ongoing threat.
Yeah, well said. Yeah, thank you so much. And I know that this is a specific topic, but it's also a really important one. Right now, COVID-19 criminalization is being used to legitimize violence against communities that are already very vulnerable. Many different forms of violence, including state-sanctioned violence. I see folks in the chat box talking about direct violence by military, by the state, by police against communities. Here in the US, data has shown that around 95% of folks who were criminalized in New York City on the basis of violating COVID-19 laws were Black and Latino folks. So we know that these laws are very much being used to reinforce existing disparities, and they're creating very dangerous precedents as well around data sharing and other types of things, and the way that health data is shared with first responders, with law enforcement. So this is very much something that we believe at Positive Women's Network that HIV decriminalization advocates need to pay close attention to. Precedents that are being set right now will have implications for HIV decriminalization work in the future, both through policy and practice. And so this is, I think, one of the most important questions for our movement to grapple with in this moment. It's also the way that narratives around science and health are being constructed and how culture is shifting right now in terms of how people think about health and about the role of police as it pertains to public health. And so I think the role of narrative work right now is also critically important, and I'm very excited that some folks are doing that. And to that point, I want to sort of pick up on the question of the use of science in HIV criminalization particularly. We had a couple of questions come through the chat box about, things like the tension of using U equals U framing, for example. What are the implications of using science, using viral suppression as a marker in HIV criminalization reform efforts? Also, how should we think about the role of things like molecular HIV surveillance as they relate to HIV criminalization? So I want to ask any of our panelists to respond. How do you think we should be thinking about nuances such as U equals U in the context of HIV criminalization? What are some of the risks? And what are some best practices you would share with participants?
Well, one of the most obvious risks is passing statutes or basically decriminalizing HIV for people who have an undetectable viral load and bringing that viral divide into the law, which is, we think, a terrible mistake. So that's one of the things that we guide with state advocates is, make sure they understand that risk and are prepared to deal with the legislator who says, okay, I get it. Let's make it okay for people who are undetectable, but still prosecute the others. So that has been one of our major educational efforts when we're working with advocates within a state trying to change their statute.
Yeah, I should note that one of the things that we talked through a lot when developing the expert consensus statement was the importance of not demarcating undetectable viral load and everyone else. So there was actually a lot of effort put into talking about trying to go around the issue of, a lot of the scientific research hasn't really had a very, very clear marker at exactly what point, a viral load, something becomes an issue. So it talks a lot about low viral load and tries to extend the implications of the expert statement as much as possible. But that being said, there is a real risk in the way we engage with these issues in a simple U equals U, applying U equals U in any simplistic form. And so I think that's really part of the discussions that are super important with community to really flesh out those issues. And, it's stigma that drives prosecution. It's the knee-jerk reaction of police or of, partners and things that drive these things forward. And that's really the point at which discussions have to, start.
There's also one practical thing about that. We're also working in my region in ECA with the prosecutors, with the parliamentarians. What we find out, they are very uneducated around HIV. Basically, they don't know anything. They're still in 80s, so they really don't have enough knowledge about that. But I also I acknowledge that there is risk when we put that, about IRBs, about, undetectable and transmitted, there is a risk there. So we were trying to push in the direction that basically in all the laws, in all the countries, there is a law about bringing harm to somebody's health intentionally, when the person wants to harm somebody. So it's better, to put that very rare case, and that was also part of the education, bring into their attention that these cases are super rare. And basically there is a law about that cases, they can go there. You just don't need a specific law about HIV. In that case, there's no even discussion around, undetectable, not undetectable. Just they have also to prove that there was intention to transmit HIV and to bring harm to health. In that case, it may become better strategy.
And if I could just say, U Equals U is a fantastic movement. It's galvanized from grassroots all around the world to focus on treatment access and viral load testing. But absolutely, for HIV criminalization, U Equals U itself is not the answer. The expert consensus statement is very clear that it talks about per at risk despite treatment, even out, without condoms, as being incredibly low, that really the criminal justice system, parliamentarians and the general public actually don't understand how difficult it is to expose or transmit HIV, especially through spitting and biting, but even through sex. And so obviously U Equals U being undetectable is a fantastic aspiration for many of us, but it's certainly not something that should ever be written into a law. It can only motivate further law reform, just to highlight just how problematic laws are, how problematic prosecutions are, and how all people living with HIV need to have access to treatment and viral load testing.
Can I just add one additional point to what has been said so far? The other things is we know from the sex work industry is that, we get criminalized because we carry condoms. So use equals use, can potentially lead to another forms of collecting evidence that you're taking PrEP, your sex workers, then we can use that to criminalize you for sex work. So these are the, the uncharted territories and, slippery slope that we are confronting right now.
Thank you so much to all our panelists. I think what I really heard is that one of the main risks is that embedding U Equals U into law risks really exacerbating existing inequalities because the folks who don't have access to treatment or ability to have suppressed viral load in the first place are those who are already most vulnerable and most likely to be surviving, violence by the state and by police. Thank you so much. We only have a few minutes left. I do want to say that we are going to go until 1:15. We're going to go 15 minutes over. Thank you to HIV 2020 for giving us a little bit of extra time to have this very rich conversation. I'm going to turn it over to my co-moderator, Paul, again, to frame the final question.
Yeah, thanks so much to everyone for so many great questions. I'm sorry that we can't get to all of them. I think I want to finish with a discussion about how we work as a movement together to respond to HIV criminalization. HIV Justice Network, we're a global, a very small organisation, but we have a global focus. We work with people on the ground, local organisations everywhere, and I particularly just want to invite some of the panellists from our African countries and from Eastern Europe and the Middle East, perhaps, to talk about how can we work together better, how do we obtain better funding, and particularly for the attendees watching, how can people find out more about that criminalisation in their own country? How can they reach out to organisations, and what are the opportunities for people to get involved in our global movement pushing back against the criminalisation of HIV? Perhaps Sarai?
Thanks for putting me on the spot. I appreciate that. But it's also quite, it's a thought-provoking question, and one that we, as we navigate this crazy COVID time, are already starting to think about, like, what is a post-COVID, in my case, Malawi, going to look like, particularly for the communities that I work with. And we see that so much is happening now, that so many of the gains that we had made just in managing HIV as a country are being rolled back as attention and funds are being poured into the COVID response. So I mentioned earlier that I checked in with the community of women living with HIV and AIDS when I was preparing for my response today. And one of the questions that I asked Mrs. Edna Tembo, who's the leader of that organization, is what do you see as the main challenges right now? Where should we be focusing our attention and our money? And she said, my concern and the concern of the women living with HIV that I work with is that we're no longer seeking out health services for other issues beyond just access to ART. So people are no longer going for cervical cancer screening. They are no longer accessing the TB treatment that they needed. SRHR services have become an issue as well. And largely because of a lot of the confusion around, are we in a lockdown, are we not in a lockdown? So there was a semi-lockdown in Malawi, and immediately a lot of services were suspended. And many communities are not even aware of the fact that services are still being offered. And so we know that going forward, we are going to have to go backwards in some ways. There's going to be a lot of messaging that needs to happen, a lot of reaching out to communities that are so far away from health services and other services, justice services, just across the board. The divide is getting deeper because the kind of stigma that we were fighting all along when it comes to HIV, we're seeing that stigma come up all over again around COVID. And so for people living with HIV in this country, it's a sense of being doubly stigmatized, a sense that you can no longer access services that were once available to you, not only because of COVID, but also because of your status as someone living with HIV. So as we go forward, we need to go back to the base. You know, we need to start all over again. We need to do the same that we were doing for HIV around COVID and vice versa. We need to keep on with the messaging. The funding has to go back into just really getting those desperate services that we need, keeping that flow of information and awareness going. That's all I can say for now. So besides the new sexy fancy work, we need to go back to that kind of grassroots engagement. Thank you, Paul. And thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, Diane. Thank you to all of our panelists. We have run out of time for the Q&A. So I'll just throw back to Nana to conclude. And I think we're going to Edwin.
Yeah, thank you so much to all of our panelists. I think the work of HIV decriminalization and the work that each of you are doing every single day is so powerful, radical, and transformative. It fundamentally challenges power relations. And that's why it's so important. And I know that we're in a very serious moment, and we've had a lot of conversation about how hard this moment is, but I also want to highlight that we are winning in a lot of places, and we are winning because of the long-term work that you all have been doing to build community power, to challenge these laws, to make sure that the leadership pipeline is robust, to make sure that those communities that are most impacted are really centered. And it's really together that we are going to win. So right now, for kind of our final comments, I'd like to introduce someone who probably needs no introduction in this movement. In his long and distinguished career, he has been an anti-apartheid lawyer, an outspoken activist for the LGBTQI and HIV communities, and a justice of the Constitutional Court of South Africa. Back in 2008, he called for a movement to end HIV criminalization, and he's been engaged with us ever since. Many of us are, riding on his legacy, including his participation in Beyond Blame in Durban and in Amsterdam. So I want to turn over to a video message from Edwin Cameron. Unfortunately, he had to leave us, but we are going to be able to hear from him by video today, his message.
Good day. I'm absolutely delighted to join you today. It has been an exciting few hours, action-packed, with exciting inputs and speeches and cries to action from a range of people. I'm here to say that we have been battling this fight for many years. Since the start of the HIV epidemic, we as gay men, as gay women, as queers, as transgender people, as sex workers, as people using drugs, have been persecuted by the criminal law. And I'm here this afternoon, morning for some of you in San Francisco, evening for some of you in Moscow. I'm here to say enough. Enough. We have achieved a great deal with our movement, with the HIV Justice Network. We have achieved a great deal in conscientizing lawmakers, lawgivers, and the public. It is now time for us to join in unison to demand the end of these stigmatizing, retrograde, unproductive, hurtful, harmful laws. It is a long struggle we've engaged in, and it's one that has hurt many of us. Some of us here today, some of us listening in, some of us who have spoken, have felt the most brutal brush of the law. They have been imprisoned, unjustly prosecuted, unjustly convicted, and unjustly sent away. HIV is not a crime, but there's more to it. Criminalizing HIV, criminalizing the transmission or exposure of HIV, as many countries on my own beautiful continent, Africa, do, is not just stupid and retrograde. It impedes the most important message of the HIV epidemic now, which is that this epidemic is manageable. I've been on antiretroviral treatment now for very nearly 23 years. My viral load has been undetectable for more than 20. We can beat this, but we have to approach this issue as a public health issue. We have to approach it rationally and sensibly and without stigma and without targeting people and without seeking to hurt and marginalize people. We've made calamitous mistakes with the misapplication of the criminal law over the last 100 years in the so-called war on drugs. We continue to make a calamitous mistake in Africa and elsewhere by misusing the criminal law against queer people like myself. We make a huge mistake by misusing the criminal law against people with HIV. Let us rise today and say enough. Thank you.
Enough is enough. Thank you, Edwin Cameron, and many thanks to Nana and Paul and to all of the guests on the virtual sofa, to all of you for asking the questions. If you want to be part of the movement to end HIV criminalization, you can go to the HIV Justice Worldwide website and join the movement. The website and the forms also available in Spanish, French, and Russian. And if you want to know more about HIV criminalization, please visit the HIV Justice Network website. As we rely on our networks and activists like you to keep the information up to date, please get in touch with us by using the contact form on the website to tell us what's going on in your country, in your community, in your organization. So now it's time to thank everyone involved in putting this together, starting with the HIV 2020 organizers, especially Rachel Ong and Naluka Pereira, and a sincere thank you to the interpreters on this webinar, without whom we wouldn't have been able to reach so many of you. Thank you to everyone on the HIV Justice Worldwide Steering Committee, of course, and thanks to my amazing team at the HIV Justice Network, especially Julian Howes and my rock, my life partner, Nicholas Feustel. And finally, most importantly, thanks to all of you for caring about HIV criminalization and for attending Beyond Blame 2020. Goodbye.